If a surveyor wants to get a good picture of the world, he uses a tripod, because anything with 3 legs does not wobble. 3 is an important number in the Bible. There's a wonderful verse used often at weddings. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken. And that's referring to the secrets of a marriage, that in a marriage there should be 3, not 2 people. A husband, a wife, and God. The cord of 3 strands. And so with our lives, in our whole Christian living, we need 3 elements of our lives. We call them the journey inward, the journey outward, and the journey shared. The journey inward is my life in Christ and Christ in me. The journey outward is my service to the world. And the journey shared is my journey with my brothers and sisters in Jesus. Green for the journey inward. Green is the color of life. Red for the journey outward, because it's ministering to the suffering of the world. And purple for the journey shared, because we are a royal priesthood together. You, my brothers and sisters, are princes and princesses in the family of God. Now, I want us this morning to spend a day with Jesus. 24 hours with Jesus. And we find it in Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14 is one day in the life of Jesus. It begins in a terrible way. Herod is having a banquet. And at his banquet, he's got a whole lot of friends, and they're all getting drunk. And then he has the bright idea of asking his stepdaughter to come and dance for them. And she dances beautifully, but one can just sense the men looking lasciviously at her. And when she's finished dancing, the king very foolishly says to her, "Ask for anything you want and I will give it to you." And her mother, who hated John the Baptist, said, "Ask for the head of John the Baptist on a platter." It is the most disgusting, awful story. Now we pick up that story in verse 10. Herod ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. It's the most disgusting story you can imagine. This beautiful young girl, just picture it, carrying a plate with a bleeding, severed head on it. Absolutely ugly. Then the disciples came, John's disciples came, they bury the body, and they go to tell Jesus. Now this is where I want you to use your imagination a little. How do you think Jesus felt when he was told the story? He would have felt tremendous anger that what he called the greatest prophet of God should be dealt with and killed in this awfully ugly, sordid way. He would have felt deep grief. This is his own cousin, after all. This is the prophet who foretold his coming. This is the man who baptized him. This is the man who announced him to the world. So deep grief, and maybe even an element of fear. If John is gone, I'm going to be next. He was human after all. And so Jesus must have felt this tremendous load of emotion. What do you do when you are facing a tremendous load of emotion? Well, we read on and we see what Jesus did. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. At this point, we must turn the colors green, because Jesus here is turning to his journey inward. He wants to be alone. And in case we don't get the message, the writer says it 3 times. Withdrew, privately, solitary. Jesus has a deep instinct and desire to be alone with these heavy emotions that have come upon him. Do you know that's a universal human reaction, to withdraw? Not just human, it's even in animals. Our first dog when we got married was a little golden Labrador. The most perfect, beautiful dog I've ever known. She would have been trained to be a guide dog for the blind, I think, in 2 days. She was absolutely wonderful. We called her Sedgefield because that's where we went on honeymoon. When she was about a year old, by mistake, she got pregnant. We weren't careful enough. And she produced 10 of the biggest mongrels you ever saw in your life. Anyway, we were quite excited and quite pleased, and we made a special box for her inside the house, specially designed so she couldn't lie on a puppy by mistake and so on, and we trained her to use the box and like it. It was a Sunday morning when she felt the labor pains coming on. Do you know what she did? She didn't go to the box. She went out into the garden under the hedge and dug herself a place. You see, when the crisis came, her instinct was to hide and to be alone. It's deep in nature. Interestingly, about 12 years later, when she was old, we suspected she had cancer, and we were debating, is it time to put her to sleep? And then one morning, for the second time in her life, she went under the hedge and dug herself a place because she was ready to die. And her instinct was to withdraw privately to a solitary place. And that is what Jesus chose to do. I want to be alone. And so we read on. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot to the towns. And when Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd. And he had compassion on them and healed their sick. I get the picture. Jesus wants to be alone. He gets in the boat deliberately to go across the lake. But the people just walk around and meet him the other side. And he gets out of the boat, and there are all the people. Now, I was a minister, and if I'd had a heavy Sunday, all I wanted on Monday was to be alone. That was time for me and God, and I didn't want others involved. And if some woman knocked on the door and came to complain about the flower arranging on the Sunday, I felt angry. This is my time. Why does she need to do this? Can't she do it on a Tuesday? That would have been my immediate reaction. I don't see any of that reaction in Jesus. I don't see anger at all. What I see is compassion. We need to change the color to red. He was wanting his inward time, his alone time, but he wasn't allowed to. The crowd came, and so just like that, Jesus switches to red and engages again in his outward journey. And the key word is that word compassion. Compassion is what drives your outward journey, your service to the world. There needs to be somewhere, someone in the world that moves you to compassion. Now, compassion is an easy word to understand. It's made up of two words. The word com, meaning with, and passion, meaning suffer. Compassion means to suffer with. Not just feel sorry for, to actually suffer with. There needs to be someone somewhere in the world, some pain in the world that makes me suffer just to see it. And I must try and do something about it. And that's what leads to your outward journey. Somewhere, somewhere. I can't minister to every pain in the world. It's far too big. But somewhere, something. And that's Jesus. He feels compassion for these people, it says elsewhere, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he starts his outward journey, ministering to them all day. How did he do that, feeling so low and so angry and so filled with grief? But he does. Ministers to them. He heals their sick. We read in the other gospel, he preaches, and he feeds them. Do you see how Jesus is ministering to the whole person? Your today need, let me give you some bread. Your bigger life need, let me heal your illness. And your eternal need, let me teach you the things of God. And that is the fullest kind of outward journey where we minister to all three of those areas. And that's what Jesus does. All day he ministers. And bear in mind that we read last week when the woman came and touched the edge of his garment, power went out of him. Well, if power went out of him, every miracle he did this day, what did he feel like by the end of the day? having started at a low level in the first place. But there he is all day. Then we read on. As evening approached, he'd been doing it all day, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place. It's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them to me," he said. Now we need to switch the color to purple. In the middle of this day of ministering, of healing, of preaching, he takes time to go to his community journey with the disciples and engage them in what he's doing. I'm not going to do this all alone. You are my brothers. Let's do this together. He says to them, you give them something to eat. That must have been quite difficult for them. What does he mean? But Jesus is engaging in the middle of this busy day on his shared journey with those disciples. He doesn't do things totally alone. And he says, bring to me what you've got. Just 2 loaves and fishes, that's okay, bring it. And let's see what we together can do. And so Jesus is engaging here in his shared journey. And so right through the day, he switches between his outward journey and his journey shared. Watch in the next reading. He directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Color that red. Here is Jesus back in his outward journey performing a miracle. But here is Jesus again in the red, the compassion, the suffering with, as he does his ministry. But we read on, then he gave this to his disciples, and the disciples gave it to the people. See, he switched to purple. I won't do all of this myself. Come, my friends, come, my brothers, be part of this with me. And I like to think that the bread multiplied in their hands as well, so that they could feel that they were part of Jesus' ministry. And so that is how Jesus operated on this very, very hard day that he lived through. Wanting a journey inward, seeing the crowd, he switches to his journey outward. During the day, he switches and involves his disciples in his shared journey, back and forth right through the day, until by the end of the day, I can hardly imagine how exhausted he must have felt. He must have been totally empty. And here is the key. Look what he does now. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. After he had dismissed the crowd, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. Switch it to green. He's back on his inward journey. He postponed it all day, maybe for 8 hours. But he can't not have it. He must get back to his inward journey. I wonder how Jesus dismissed the crowd. Because people flocked to him. They didn't want to leave him ever. How did he get them to leave? Did he say to them, it's time for you to go home now. I need to be alone. And perhaps the power that Jesus had in his speaking just got through to them, and they turned gratefully and went home. And he turned and went up. And there again the word comes twice, by himself, alone. The secret of the inward journey is by yourself, alone, with your God. And so Jesus engages in these 3 journeys all day. In the most wonderful way, he goes from one to the other, but back to the first. I must be alone. We're not even told that he slept that night. Perhaps he slept a little on the mountain. But very early in the morning, he's on his way again. The boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. Jesus went out to them. Color it purple. He's back on his journey shared. He's had his silent time, his private time. Now he's back with his brothers. continuing the journey. And our 24 hours is over. During this week, as I meditated on this passage, I felt exhausted just reading this. How did he do it? This terrible news about John, the deep grief, the anger, maybe a touch of fear, needing to be alone, and then the crowd comes and he ministers all day, healing, preaching, dividing the bread, and all the time working with his disciples, keeping together with them. What was his secret? Because I would have collapsed, I think. Well, the secret was he knew how to live the 3 journeys. And he knew that he must have that inward journey. And I believe that was how he coped with this incredibly stressful time. There was a day when Albert Einstein was on a train, this great scientist, but he was very absent-minded like many of those great scientists. He was on a train and the conductor came along and didn't recognize him and asked for his ticket. And he felt in his pockets like a typical scientist, couldn't find his ticket. And the conductor said, "Don't worry, I'll come back in 10 minutes and you can see if you found your ticket." 10 minutes later, the conductor came back and there was Albert Einstein on the floor searching under the seats. His briefcase was open, papers were everywhere. And then the conductor recognized who he was. And he said, "You're Mr. Einstein. Please don't worry about the ticket. I trust you." And Mr. Einstein looked up from the floor and he said, "Young man, it's not a matter of trust. If I don't find my ticket, I won't know where I'm going. If I don't have my ticket, I won't know where I'm going." And that's kind of an image for us in life. If I don't have the ticket, I won't know where I'm going. And the ticket is time with God to find out what he wants of me. Otherwise, I'm just busy and running off my feet. I need to have a word from my Father so I know where I'm going and what I'm supposed to do. When I was in the ministry full-time, I made a habit of going to ministers who seemed to be running healthy churches and seemed to be healthy in themselves, and I would ask them a question: what is your secret? I even flew up to Johannesburg specially for a meeting with one person by the name of Kostas Stathakis, the minister of Bryanston Methodist Church. I spent an hour with him discussing how he ran his church and things like that. Then at the end, I asked him my question: "Costa, of all the things we've talked about, what would you put as the secret of how you manage?" He didn't think for long, and then he gave this answer: time for Costa and God. Time for Costa and God. Time for Andrew and God. Time for Gloria and God. Time for Brandon and God. Time for Lorraine and God. Time for Noel and God. Time for Mike and God. Time for Anand and God. Time for Lily and God. Time for Lynn and God. Time for you and God.